All right. Good morning, everyone. And again, welcome to the August 22nd Morning Mug to discuss a bit of the history of the Arlington Democrat School Board Endorsement Caucus, as well as some kind of more recent community comments about the caucus. We're really glad to be joined by Mary Hines, former Arlington County Board member and Arlington School Board member, one of our first elected school board members here in the county. And she's going to talk a little bit more about that history. Tanya Talento, one of our former school board members from the more recent history that came from the community grassroots activism before running in the caucus. And then I'll also be providing some comments. My name is Maggie Davis. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Arlington County Democratic Committee, and I served as the School Board Caucus Deputy Director in the 2015 caucus. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Great to be with everybody today. So I'm going to give you the historical perspective on how we got to where we are today. But there are three key things that you need to know before we get into the actual story of electing school boards in this, what I would call the modern era. The first thing is that there is a law called the Hatch Act of 1939. Its subtitle is to prevent pernicious political activity. This was passed during the Roosevelt years, and it was a response to perceived intimidation of voters by public officials. The act provides that people below the policymaking level in the executive branch of the federal government must not only refrain from political practices that would be illegal for any citizen, but must abstain from any active part in political campaigns. And in 1940, a year later, they extended the act to certain employees of state and local governments whose positions were primarily paid for by federal funds. And it has been interpreted to bar state and local employees, local government employees from running for public office if any federal funds supported their position. This was in 39 and 40. The act has subsequently been amended, but when elected school boards began, this was a big part of the conversation. The second fact you need to know is that the Democratic Party of Virginia was controlled by the Byrd machine, BYRD, for decades, named after a governor. This machine was very conservative. It controlled many local elected offices, and it was staunchly segregationist. And it's the group that's known in our history for using massive resistance to school integration in the 50s. Another important point. And finally, the last thing you need to know is that people came from all over America to Arlington during the 1940s. They were attracted by what the Roosevelt administration was doing. They were generally well-educated people, and many of the women were college graduates, and the vast majority of households had children in them. So following World War II, Arlingtonians for a Better County was created by progressive Democrats, independents, and a few Republicans because they were federal employees and they were hatched. So they wanted an opportunity to participate in nonpartisan selection process for county board candidates. And they also wanted to develop policy positions and advocacy on issues of the day. Initially, ABC was deeply involved in fixing what was then a sorely underfunded, mediocre school system. I've heard stories from people who went to school then who said that that school was only a half a day. They didn't want to build more buildings. And so you went to high school for 4 hours, and then a different group of kids came and went for 4 hours. In 1949, led by advocacy from the ABC, Arlington got permission to have an elected school board from the General Assembly. It was the only elected school board in the Commonwealth. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which declared separate but unequal schools unconstitutional. In early 1956, after the release of a school board chartered committee's report recommending that APS gradually desegregate the schools, the Virginia General Assembly held a special session and voted to unseat Arlington's elected school board. Those elected members were replaced with appointed members more agreeable to holding the line on segregation through massive resistance. So Arlington had appointed school board members for 38 years. Initially, the members were appointed by circuit court judges who were appointed by the General Assembly, which was then controlled by that Democratic bird machine I mentioned earlier. At some point, appointments switched to the county board. Up until the mid 80s, late 80s, those appointments were 1-for-1. When a new county board member was elected, that person selected and appointed a school board member. Mary Margaret Whipple served on the school board before she went to the county board. And when she joined the county board, which I think was in 1987, the process for selecting school board members was changed to a whole board decision, and there were applications and interviews. The last person who was chosen this way was Margaret Lampe in 1995, and she replaced Republican Charles Cervantes, who resigned. So getting back to having an elected school board was a goal for a long time, but there was a General Assembly Senate committee that was the stumbling block for many, many years. They just would never report it out of committee. So in 1992, a bipartisan majority of the General Assembly Senate committee finally approved a process for localities to use to get back to an elected school board. And once it came out of committee, it was easily approved by the full General Assembly with a strong majority. The process involved collecting signatures from 10% of the registered voters and then putting the question to the voters using a referendum on the ballot. So initially, the Arlington elected county board and the Democratic Party were split over the issue, with many publicly somewhat opposed to moving to school board elections. There was a fear adding 5 more elected officials would be a stress on the system and all of this kind of, so it was not consensus. So a bipartisan group of parents led by Chris Zimmerman, who may be a name familiar to you, ultimately ran for and served on the county board for a long time, and Jackie Snelling, a longtime Republican parent activist, organized the signature drive, and the group was successful in getting the question on the ballot for the 1993 November election. And then the referendum was overwhelmingly passed by the public. So now we have permission to have an election. Now, there were several limitations on school board elections in the original statutes. First one was that there could be no partisan nominations. So parties couldn't nominate, but they could use an endorsement process if they so chose. Second one was that the structure of the school board had to follow the structure of the county board, which in our case was 5 at-large people, 1 elected every year. 1 year there's a double. Unless a difference existed prior to the enabling school board elections. So for instance, in Fairfax, they had 5 at-large members on the school board that they did not have on the county board. And so those differences were allowed to persist. And then the third limitation was in the case of a death or a resignation, the school board would appoint someone until the next general election. There would not be a special election. So all of those rules meant that in Arlington, there would be a gradual shift to elected members over a 4-year period. By the end of the first 4-year period, there were 3 members who'd been elected only and 2 who had previously been appointed and then elected. So that's kind of the shape of this. So at the same time all of this petitioning was going on, or collecting of signatures was going on, the futures of schools was a significant community conversation and controversy beginning in about 1992. There had been a significant growth in the student body over the last probably 5 or 6 years. And there was a lot of increase in student diversity, especially language diversity. The big question in the school community was how best to manage growth and diversity while maintaining high school quality at every school. And this became the focus of a large community process called Futures Planning that I led. The planning process itself involved more than 150 people. 2/3 of them were Arlington residents and 1/3 of them were school teachers. We met 54 times in 52 weeks. And ultimately, the group recommended using public school choice to encourage integration of the element at the elementary school level and making significant changes to secondary school boundaries. The process and recommendations led to the creation of two opposing parent groups. One was called United for Excellence, which was for the changes, and the other was called the Friends of Neighborhood Schools, which advocated against the recommendations. Now, I'm going to go back to the Hatch Act. I'm sorry to keep circling, but that's the way this worked. After several failed attempts to change the Hatch Act in the 70s and 80s, in 1993, so this is the year when our referendum passes to get to school boards, the advocates for removing or modifying restrictions on the political activities of federal employees succeeded in enacting the Hatch Act Reform Amendments of 1993 that remove the prohibition on participation in the political management or political campaigns. So the rules got better for lots of federal employees, but not all of the rules were gone. Federal employees are still forbidden to use their authority to affect the results of an election. They are also forbidden to run for office in a partisan election, to solicit or receive political contributions, and to engage in political activities while on duty or on federal property. So this caused a kind of a come to Jesus moment, if you will, for the ABC. What was it going to do? The parties had come in and were nominating county board members, and that seemed to be working okay. And now here's this new opportunity for school board members. And was ABC going to play a role? And if so, what would that role be? And what would the rules be? So that first school board election was scheduled to take place in November of '94. And ABC, which was led, interestingly, by Barbara Favola, our senator these days, ABC convened a group to plan for a nonpartisan selection process for school board members. Because of its roots, having had both independents, Republicans, and Democrats involved, ABC advocated for a process that would be open to any registered voter in Arlington. Now, involved in those early talks that Senator Favola led were the Democratic Party chair, Kevin Appel, the Republican Party chair, Scott McGarry, someone from United for Excellence. I was initially that person, but when I decided to run, somebody else stepped in, and Friends of Neighborhood Schools. After a lot of discussion, the parties agreed, each of the participants in that conversation, except ABC, agreed not to conduct their own selection processes. And the Democrats indicated that they would likely endorse the winner of the ABC caucus. The initial caucus was scheduled for late May of 1994 at Thomas Jefferson Community Center. There were two candidates. I was one, and then school board chair Conchita Mitchell, who was in her 8th year as an appointed member, was the other one. The caucus took place on a weeknight for approximately 2.5 hours. Prior to allowing any voting to begin, speeches were required to be given by the two candidates. And we had a power outage that night. So we gave those speeches in the TJ gym with big Klieg lights running off of generators. And once the speeches were concluded, the voting took place using paper ballots. And in my memory, approximately 2,600 people voted in those few hours. And I did win by a good margin. Following that, the Democratic Party endorsed me. David Foster, who was a Republican and former Civic Federation chair, jumped into the race on the last day for independents to file with the state for the November election. So there was a robust fall campaign that first year as well. And I won. I carried all but 9 of the precincts. So from 1995 to 1999, ABC continued to run this process. I think that hours got lengthened a little bit as it went along, but basically they ran the process all the way through. In 1999, David Foster, who I had beaten in '94 in the general, decided that he was going to seek the ABC nomination or endorsement, sorry. And there had been quite a bit of change in the membership of ABC. It had become more independent and more Republican and less associated with the Democrats. And Dave won that process. I was trying to remember yesterday whether anybody ran against him. I don't think so, because when he indicated he was going to run, the Democrats decided they pulled back. And Sharon Davis, who was a former party chair, was endorsed by the Democrats. She was also active in schools. Anyway, she ran against Dave in '99, and Dave won in the general election. So that caused a lot of thinking, I think, on everybody's part about what to do in 2000. ABC voted to add a pledge by candidates that they would accept the results of the ABC caucus and not seek election with another partisan endorsement. And so that would have in effect made ABC the decider. And then in 2000, the Republicans announced that they would make a party endorsement, and then the Dems decided to hold their first school board endorsement. And these changes resulted in the end of ABC and ultimately the demise of ABC. So that's kind of how we got to where we are today. It was not a straight line. Lots of people were involved, but that is that's the heart of the story there, Maggie. And so I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mary. And we really appreciate your knowledge and history, having lived a lot of it and knowing a lot of the players. I know a lot of that predates my involvement in the county. So it's always nice to know the background. We're going to switch now to a little more recent history and experience to Tanya Talento, who was elected to the Arlington County School Board in 2016. Tanya came in as a grassroots advocate and was not active in the party prior to running, and would really appreciate to hear her thoughts, both as someone that was not familiar with the endorsement process until getting involved with it, as well as a little bit about diversity and just kind of the history of diverse boards within the Arlington County School Boards.
Hey, Maggie, this is Mary again. Can I just add one thing I forgot to say, but is important, I think, as this lead into Tanya, which is that in those early years, nobody who ran for school board was well connected in the party. The only thing I'd ever done for the party was hand out a sample ballot before I decided to run. And I think if we go back and look, we'll see it. And in most people's bios, they decided to run for school board, and then they became, they figured out who they knew in the party, but people were not party activists. I do think that's important.
Great, Tanya, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mary, for that history and for your last comments. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. So I was very active in the schools community. I have 5 children, 3 stepsons and 2 of my own. And at the time, I think I had 3 who were still in the schools, 2 had graduated, and I had been involved in school in my children's schools, I think since 2011, 2010. And then through my activism and getting involved in school board advisory committees, I had gotten on a joint county board school board committee. I started to learn about community leaders, work with community leaders. And I found that I was bringing a perspective that was not common in the committees. I did not graduate college. Prior to my second marriage, I had been a single parent. I had also grown up low income, grew up most of my life with free and reduced lunch, so much to a point that I assumed when I was, even as a young mother, that everyone had to fill out a free and reduced lunch form. I thought that it was just mandatory for every single family to fill it out, and that then they would decide who qualified, because that is all I knew. And I was a working class family living check to check for much of my life until I slowly started moving up through my work. I was started as a file clerk and eventually became a legal secretary, and was in the field for 15 years. I started working when I was 18. I was going to community college at night. I was caring for my brother. So I just had a very non-traditional life. And when I had the opportunity to finally dedicate my life to community service, I chose schools because it was something my parents weren't able to do for us. And I had children who I really wanted to be successful in this country and in life in general. And my family were immigrants. We did not speak English at home, so I was an English learner family. So I started to find that I was bringing this perspective to committees that just did not exist. And it was intimidating many times walking into committees with people who had PhDs and master's degrees and bachelors, but it was important that I started to realize it was important that there be a voice there that represented people that may not have the opportunity because they're working full-time and raising a family. So I really was not aware of the Democratic Party. I was not really aware of local elections. My mother died before she could become a citizen of this country, and my father got his citizenship much later in life. So I knew about voting in the presidential elections. I had an idea that there was annual elections, and that was probably the extent of my understanding of voting in the US. So I think my caucus was actually the first caucus that I voted in. I didn't understand the importance of it. And so when I was asked to run, it was not something that I'd been thinking about. But Dr. Emelyan Sanchez was retiring she was not going to seek re-election. And having served on all of these committees, I understood the importance of having diversity in our electoral representation. And I had the privilege of actually not having to work a full-time job at that time. And I felt ready, especially with my most recent service on the community facility studies, where I learned a wealth of information about county government and how county and schools work and how county and schools do not work together. So and there was not a lot of Latina leaders at the time that actually had what I'll say the resume to run, because our communities of color, a lot of our communities of color are working class. So we don't have a lot of, at the time in 2016, there were not a lot of Latina leaders who had served on committees, who were known in schools, whether it was through PTA or like I was a band booster parent because my child was in band and my son had been in chorus, and I had gone on the English Learner Advisory Committee and the Math Advisory Committee. So a lot of us didn't have that, but there are about 3 of us Latina leaders who had that type of resume. So I haven't touched on the caucus because the caucus was not something that I understood at the time. And so my other two colleagues who felt that we had the confidence that they could win as a Latino leader did work full time. And I remember having the discussion, well, what are we going to do? And we decided, okay, well, I have the time and I can do it. And I was nervous and I said, okay. And I did not understand what I was getting myself into. So then I find out about this caucus. I knew that I had to go and learn about the Democratic Party. That made sense to me. I was a Democrat. I was going to want their support. Okay, that all was logical. And I remember a meeting saying, well, you're going to have to seek out the endorsement. And I thought, well, if I lose the endorsement, I'll have to decide if I still want to run. And I said, well, I'd probably do that. I've been an underdog my whole life. Nothing's wrong with being an underdog as an adult. And, I feel that I could do this. And it's important that we have, diversity on the board. That was my mindset. It wasn't until much, and I remember saying that to someone, they're like, well, I don't know if you should, I don't know if you can do that. And I didn't really understand. So when I filed the paperwork for the caucus, I'm a reader and I read every single line. And in there, the paperwork for the Democratic caucus stated that if I lost the caucus, I couldn't, I was signing, I was giving my word that I would not run against the Democratic endorsee. And that was very surprising to me. And it's not something that I really agreed with, but again, my goal was to serve on the school board, bring the experience that I had and bring my perspectives, the very many perspectives that I would bring to the table that I thought did not exist on the board at that time. And I started to run for the caucus. The party did not know me. I'm innately shy, but I've worked through that my whole life. So when I started going to the meetings, I was very quiet. I was observing. I started to meet a few people. I prepared for my first announcement speech. I worked very hard. I was working with some people who actually were on the steering committee. And shortly after I announced, the person I was working with actually started bullying me, I suppose. She started sharing lies about me and basically trashing my campaign. Wrote a letter to all the electeds about how I was a liar and all these things. It was a very horrible experience for me. And she was on the Democratic Steering Committee. And so I had to make some decisions about whether to pull out. Did I want to deal with this bullying? Did I want to put my family through this? And there were a few leaders that said, Tanya, we really think your voice is needed on the school board. Please stay in. I had friends rooting for me in the community that were not part of the party. And so I chose to stay. There are people who went to the Democratic meeting that heard me speak, met with me, believed in me, and fought for me. And there are people in the Democratic committee and in the meetings who, weren't sure what to believe and didn't know who I was and stayed away from me. And there were 4 people during my caucus race running for 2 seats. I bring all that out because I think it's important to understand that my experience in running in the caucus was not, I was not a party favored person. I hear comments in the community about the caucus picks party favorites or, insiders or something like that. I'm not sure the real definition of what a Democratic Party insider is. Maybe it means if you're on the steering committee or you're a precinct captain or something like that. I'm not sure. So I continued to run. I continued to debate. And when the caucus came, a lot of people who knew me from all of the committees that I served and in the Latino community came to vote at the caucus because I shared information about what that was. I educated my supporters about what the caucus was, about what it meant to vote. I educated the Latino voters who, much like me, did not know what the caucus was. I reached out to other communities of color and tried to speak to them about my commitment to represent everyone, in particular communities that were underrepresented or did not have voices in our traditional systems. And I won the school board caucus. And then I continued to the general election. We did not have anyone run against us. It was me and Nancy who won the school board caucus at that time. And I had to get the signatures and file by June. So I did all that. And the other thing that I really was just surprised by was also the pledge that was needed when I had people who were, I had friends who were Republicans, friends who were independent, who believed that I, as a Democrat, that I would be a great school board member and just as a person. And when they came to the caucus, they said, Tanya, we can't sign that pledge. So, and I said, I totally understand because I was unaware that that pledge existed. So when we talk about the caucus today and, recent elections and the discussion that has come about, I do think that there's changes that need to be made to the caucus. I do not know if eliminating the caucus is going to solve the issues. I think endorsement is not a legal requirement. Therefore, anyone can endorse. And so the Democrats are choosing to endorse. I am a Democrat. After I experienced the caucus and I started going to the meetings, I also started to meet some pretty amazing Arlingtonians who feel so strongly about the democratic values that the way I had dedicated my life to schools committees and school work and school advocacy, they had dedicated their community service to the democratic values and electing Democrats. And these are all Arlingtonians. And I have not, I was always impressed by the hard work that they did in their values that they believed in. And that was, it was unexpected for me. So, I gained an appreciation through that. I advocated, as did other people, that we needed to increase diversity in the party. Over the years, that has grown. There's still, I think, things working out. But when I joined the party, there was not the level of outreach committees that exist today. There was definitely not a Latino caucus, which I worked on with other Democratic leaders to create. It's definitely more diverse today than it was when I started. With the welcome piece, as a Latina, there's a very different cultural experience that I have being welcomed into something. And I've learned as a bicultural Latina here in the US, being born here, understanding the cultural dynamics of the systems, the Euro-American systems that exist versus the systems that I grew up with as bicultural and a daughter of immigrant parents, and and being from Guatemala. So I started to look at those and analyze those, and I bring all that up because I think there is growth that has taken place, and there's still a lot of growth that needs to take place. But I also think it's time that we grow the caucus or change the caucus to accommodate that. I know that there's been discussion about eliminating the caucus, and I've thought about that. I've done an analysis about it. So if we eliminate the caucus, there's always going to be someone else who comes to endorse. And as a person who, at the time, prior to my running and prior to my second marriage, working overtime quite a bit, depending on services like extended day, having to be a single mother for a while, managing healthcare in the past for someone who had mental health care issues and so forth. My ability to research candidates, my ability to be involved in who is running and who is not, and to understand that was non-existent. My focus was caring for my family, working every day. It was survival from one day to the next, to making sure that my kids were in a stable home they could be, considering all the environmental factors impacting my immediate family. And I didn't have a lot of support systems in place, being from an immigrant family. That's very common, that your support system is your community and not necessarily extended family, because they're not here. So I share that because one of the things that I found after being in the running for school board is that a lot of community members say, Tanya, I hear there's an election. Who's can advocate for us? Who's voting for us? I have the time to do that research. And at that time, when I started to learn about elections, I was one of those people going to friends that I knew who were involved. Who's a good candidate? Who understands the challenges of our community? Who's going to represent us? And so I do have concerns about eliminating a caucus that is led by Arlington Democrats who strongly believe in democratic values and are looking to elect people who represent our values to local offices for the sake of what I don't understand the concern is. Regarding the Hatch Act, I don't know. For me, I would be one of the people more than happy to help start something like Arlingtonians for Better County again. I think that competition is healthy. I think that there should be other endorsement processes led by community groups. Here in Arlington, when we take something down, there's something else that's going to come up, because Arlingtonians are active community activists, generally lobbyists, in nature. That's what we do here in Arlington. If you get involved in any part of Arlington, whether it's school, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's social justice, whether it's local government, you have people who work hard and are active and will fight for what they believe in, and will put together groups and grow them and make things happen. So, I'm not sure that the elimination of something like this is going to be better or different. I think something else will come and pass, just like ABC existed and it left. The school board caucus exists that's run by the Dems. It could leave and something else will come in place, and it will just be a cycle. So where I am today is, how can we change the caucus to better improve inclusivity and make sure that everyone has a fair chance to run, whether it's seeking the endorsement or not. And I think it's a healthy discussion to have, which is why I decided to be on this panel. Um, I would definitely support changes to the caucus. I think that if you win if you lose the caucus, you should be able to run. I don't see why we have that clause in there. That doesn't make sense. Competition is good. So you didn't get the Democratic endorsement. Great. Go ahead and run. Let the people decide who to choose. This is who local Democrats chose. And I think that would also open the door for people who are in the federal government can seek an endorsement, because at that time, then we have competition and people running and seeking those campaigns. And the Democratic endorsee is just the person who got the endorsement, just like when you seek endorsements from public officials, from the Arlington Education Association and other PACs. But, you know, I'm looking forward to the Q&A part of the discussion. I think this is an important discussion to have. And I know, Maggie, you wanted to share some things about changes.
Well, Tanya, did you want to talk about the history of diversity on the board?
Oh, yes, I think that's important. Thank you for bringing that up. One of the reasons, again, that I ran is because Dr. Amy Villan Sanchez, who was the first Latina elected to the school board, was leaving office. And I felt that it was important to have the Latino perspective on the board, considering that about 25 to 30% of the student population in Arlington Public Schools at the time was Latino. And so I started to do some history about the diversity on the school board, understanding what that was about. And I think that's still a lot of work to do, but we have had some diversity on the school board, and I think it's important to keep it there. And I was disappointed that this year we lost the seat, that we will not have a Black African-American person serving on the school board. But if you look at the history, Honorable Eleanor Monroe was the first appointed African-American Black school board member to Arlington School Board. And that was followed by the Honorable Dr. Thomas Penn, who was also appointed, and then the Honorable Evelyn Syfax, who was also appointed. And then the Honorable Frank Wilson, who I had the privilege and honor to meet and sit with, and he provided me a lot of really wonderful advice when I was seeking election. He was appointed in 1984. And then when 1994, he was born in 1984, and when 1994 came, he was still serving his appointed term, but he chose to run when his term expired and was elected in 1996. And he served and then resigned. I think his last year was 2007. I don't know if you remember, Mary, but I think there was a year between him and James Lander where there was not an African-American Black person serving on the school board.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Yep. And so then James Lander ran. I know that he sought the Democratic endorsement. I'm not sure if Frank Wilson sought the Democratic endorsement, because if you were not contested, there is no endorsement process.
There was a Democratic process in 1996. There were 3 people vying for 2 seats.
Okay, great. And then the Honorable Monique O'Grady followed James Lander. They ran against each other and she won his seat. When we look at the history of Latino school board members, there's only one Latino appointed school board member that we are aware of. And I say that because I think people do not claim their Latino heritage, or they do not identify as Latino. Maybe that's really the better way to say it. They do not identify as Latino. But we know that Charles Cervantes, who I believe was a Republican, he was appointed in 1992. He resigned before his term was up. And then there was not another Latino appointed or elected to office until Dr. Emma Villan Sanchez, who was elected in 2008. And she served through 2016, which is when I was elected. And then I served through 2020, which is when the Honorable Cristina Diaz-Torres was elected. So there has been diversity on the school board through these processes. I do hope that there's a time where it won't be one person of each, where it won't be a token representative, although I know for a fact that every single person on this list believed and worked hard in the school systems and believed in improving the school systems and fighting for students, and had extraordinary community service resumes in school advocacy before running. Every single person on this list was involved in education, whether it was through work, committees, or a combination thereof. And I think that that has continued even through the most recent elections. So, I do think that there is room for change and improvement and growth. I don't know if the elimination is the answer, because I do believe, yet again, as I said, that other organizations will come up and will create the same type of perception. And I think more is better versus having one. I think competition is good and it's healthy. And I think there's ways to have everyone exist within this realm of endorsement processes and ensuring that we have a strong representatives on the school board. And so Maggie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tanya. Let me. All right, so I wanted to start off, as Tanya mentioned, there is, in both Tanya and Mary, there is not a requirement to endorse, but there is also not a prohibition to endorse. So under current Virginia law, we do not have a mechanism to have a primary process for school board, which is something that as the Democratic Party, we would honestly prefer. I believe both myself and the current chair, Jill Cayazzo, has been very vocal that we support primary processes wherever they are possible. And the current process does not preclude other groups from endorsing. In fact, you will see that there are a lot of other organizations such as the teachers unions, I believe the Civic Federation, other organizations.
Not the Civic Federation.
Thank you, Mary. But definitely the teachers union do endorse in school board processes. And that is happening. I think that might happen a little closer to the general election. The big difference for the Arlington County Democratic Committee endorsement process is that we are making an effort to identify one candidate that embodies the democratic values, to really try and have that a identified Democrat to support in the general election, instead of having, say, 5 Democrats that might all get the endorsement, and then you end up spreading the vote, and it makes the chances of a non-Democrat winning higher. So it really, it's about, in the parlance of like lessening the field early. That's terrible phrasing, but basically,
So Maggie,
set up is to be as close to a primary as possible.
right, and I would say that that was the goal in the ABC as well. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that during my part, but there was a real worry that, you know, you could have 10 people run and the vote would be so split that no one would win with more than 10 or 12%. And that was a concern to all of the groups involved in the conversation back in the 90s.
Yes, and so when the Arlington Democrats focus on the endorsement process, the goal is to try and make sure that you have a candidate that embodies democratic values as selected by the Democrats that vote in the caucus. So it is not, you know, an amorphous group in a back room. It is not like specific leaders choosing. It is as open of a process as we possibly can have as to which candidate the Arlington Democrats, and that's the people that are Democrats, not just the party leadership, can get behind for the general election. And so we've been holding this process in a number of ways. Most people are familiar with the in-person caucuses that we held from the 2000 to 2019, and hopefully will come back. Maybe, we don't know, because the past 2 years of the pandemic have really changed the environment that we work in. So the in-person caucuses usually happened over 2 days in 2 schools. It was usually a Thursday night and then a Saturday for longer extended voting. The locations chosen, there was a desire every year to have a location in South Arlington and a location in North Arlington, and to have at least one of the locations metro accessible to represent, or to make it easier to get to for people that might not have access to a car. There were limitations in the in-person caucuses. We were not able to identify a way to securely have absentee voting for a caucus. So while it was a paper ballot using ranked choice voting, there was not a way to practicably account for absentee voting. Now, due to the 2019 or COVID-19 pandemic, we did have a rapid shift in the 2020 caucus to an all vote by mail system. Now that was an extraordinary effort that happened after we passed our initial rules. So the Arlington Democrats, when they have their call to caucus, there is a document drafted that is voted and approved by the steering committee, and then also the voting membership of the party as to what the rules of the caucus are and the important deadlines. There is a small registration fee to help kind of offset the cost of running the caucus. And that call to caucus most times has envisioned an in-person system that we've been doing for about 2 decades. In 2020, the initial call to caucus was approved by the committee. And then in March of that year, after we already had a number of candidates filed and announced and were running as that plan, got side railed by the pandemic. So we did have to have an emergency change the rules to an all vote by mail caucus. This process at minimum probably takes about two months to operate because we do not have the same benefits as the electoral board as far as mail prioritization. So what this really means is that our mail, as we were mailing ballots out after they were requested, moves slower than the regular Board of Elections. So to account for that, it just requires a little bit more lead time. And then also we had to have some certain limitations on getting the ballots back. So there was a lot of negotiations about the last several days of mail returning, partly because there was known concerns within the Postal Service. So I will say we're really thankful that we had some community members that helped us make sure that there was an ability to drop off ballots if people felt like that was too close to the deadline. In that caucus, the mail only, we were fortunate to have, I believe, nearly 6,000 ballots cast. And it was one of the highest turnout caucuses that we have ever had. Now, in 2021, the Arlington Democrats were again hopeful to have a in-person caucus. Our hope had been to have some sort of outdoor in-person voting system. And the small team of volunteers that had been kind of identified as caucus leaders and volunteers that were interested in helping administer the caucus, it did make a lot of efforts to find and secure a location for an in-person version of the caucus. Unfortunately, they weren't successful. There were no venues that were available to secure that would both enable kind of the paper ballot system that we had beforehand. So we weren't able to like find an actual location. However, that team was able to secure a grant to do an online voting system, balloting system for the first time. So that had another change of rules that led to our first online voting balloting system. And then in accompanying with that, several in-person voting assistance locations where it would be not a true in-person voting experience with a paper ballot because the system didn't allow us to do both, but to have access to the internet and a computer for individuals that might not either feel comfortable voting but at their home or need additional assistance, or might not have access to a computer that they felt like they could use in that manner. So we had 4 locations. Do want to thank our outreach team that was able to secure a location at Cafe Cezanne, since there was some concerns expressed about having all of the locations at individuals' homes, which was the initial plan, because those were the areas that we were able to secure both agreements to be there as well as regional diversity within the county. So there was a location in South Arlington, Metro Accessible Central Arlington, and North Arlington. So kind of going back, mentioned some of this of why the school board caucus. The current reading of the Virginia Code does not provide a mechanism for the party to hold a primary election for school board. Now, schools, as we've seen over the past several months in particular, from the Democratic, there is a they're political. We do have a role of a partisan organization having a voice into which candidates embody democratic values. And so the Arlington Democrats have consistently taken it upon themselves to identify in as broad of a consensus fashion as we are practicably able to do which candidates hold our democratic values, so that when we are, educating voters and reaching out to voters for the general election, that we can speak to which candidates are the Democratic endorsees. Again, we've been trying to hold this process as close to a primary as practicable, because of the view that a primary is the mechanism best for the party to identify the strongest candidates that embody our values. Now, since we are not able to have an actual primary at this time, we've been operating the caucus as close to a primary as possible. What that means is that the part of the function of the caucus is to identify kind of which is the one candidate that we would, one or depending on the year, two candidates that we would support in the general. And that is where you do end up, as Tanya mentioned in our call to caucus, the ask of people seeking the endorsement that if they do not get the endorsement, to not file to run in addition. And that is a mechanism to try and kind of make it as close to a primary as possible. Now, to the other element that Tanya mentioned, which was the party pledge, that is something that comes from the Democratic Party of Virginia rules, and that the current pledge is something that the state party kind of oversees, and that as a local party, we are not able to deviate from. So that is kind of the groundwork. I did want to take a minute to talk about some of the efforts that we have been taking as a party to address some of these concerns that are not new to the party or the committee. The first of one is the Hatch Act that Mary talked quite extensively about in the history. And I know I was appreciative. I didn't know a lot of that history of the changes in 1994. Leaders in the party in working on the school board caucus did reach out to congressional members from our delegation about whether there is a possibility to have alterations to the Hatch Act to allow a federal employee to seek endorsement from a partisan organization. The response we got was, I think, very honest, that there is just not at that time, it was politically untenable with what was happening in the Trump administration at the time to change any rules of partisan activities for federal employees. Now, that being said, we did take it upon ourselves that several volunteers with legal backgrounds did develop a Hatch Act compliance fact sheet for candidates interested in running. And I would like to point out that since Tanya's experience, which I know she was very, I think, surprised by some elements, we've made a lot of efforts to have more prospective candidate resources available to candidates interested to run. So for the past 4 years, we've been holding prospective candidate open houses to go over some of these items and backgrounds, and the materials like the Hatch Act compliance fact sheet are available to anyone seeking the Democratic endorsement. To the party pledge, again, the caucus leadership actively but unsuccessfully asked DPVA for approvals and revisions to the pledge. That is just something that has not changed from the state party and would require a change at a level higher than us. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on some voter outreach efforts over the past several years, where we have been really making a more concerted effort to reach out to communities that have not historically voted in the school board caucus. Now, that said, the voters of the school board caucus are almost entirely driven by the candidates in the race. The candidates in the race are the community members that can bring out people that are interested in the schools and interested in the issues. The Arlington Democrats largely function as the mechanism for the endorsement, and facilitate the process. But we have made it a big effort to enhance our outreach, and particularly with thanks to our more robust outreach caucuses. So with that, I know we are a little over time and we started late. So I'm going to quickly stop share and start moving us to Q&A shortly.
You can